Hello, welcome back to the Giant Papist. This is the and reading. This is the gospel reading and reflection for Monday of Holy Week. As promised in my recent video I posted for Saturday before Palm Sunday and Palm Sunday, the one that was scheduled for today, had I remembered to do things on time, is going to be for today as well. The reading comes to us again from John's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. This is John's account of the anointing of Jesus at Bethany. And John clarifies that while that the anointing took place 6 days before the Passover, or the evening before Jesus has made his messianic procession into Jerusalem. So we are going back in time from where we began with the procession gospel reading for Palm Sunday. We're going back to the evening before, according to John's gospel. All right, so with that out of the way, let us get to the reading. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at table with him. Mary took a pound of costly ointment of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to take what was put into it. Jesus said, "Let her alone, let her keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." When the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came, not only on account of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus also to death, because on account of him many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Thus endeth the gospel reading for this video. So first things first, at the end there, as I mentioned during my video on the raising of Lazarus, Lazarus starts to face persecution from Jesus' human opponents, who also seek to put him to death because Jesus' miraculous raising of Lazarus was undoubtedly significant. It is one of the most important miracles of his public ministry, given how many conversions we see happen afterwards. So, wanted to make that note that just because Lazarus was raised from the dead doesn't mean he was safe or didn't have to undergo continued suffering. But let us go to the scene of the anointing itself. Lazarus is hosting Jesus and his disciples. The synoptics clarify this occurred in the house of Simon the leper. But Mary and Martha, or at least Martha, is serving Lazarus as the host is sitting at table with the invited guests, and the youngest sibling, Saint Mary of Bethany, who John's gospel identifies as the unnamed woman in the synoptic Gospel's account of this same event brings a costly oil of spikenard, very expensive fragrance, and she proceeds to anoint the feet of Jesus and wiping his feet with her hair. This is a very significant act of devotion. In fact, let us see what the other synoptics have to say of this same event, on just how seemingly out of nowhere this would have been. So, first, let us go to Matthew. Yes. So, Matthew's account of the anointing of Bethany. Now, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman, notice that Matthew doesn't name her, even though he was there, so he would have known it was Mary of Bethany. A woman came up to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at table. But when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this ointment might have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Right? So that was Matthew. Let us go to Mark. So if I'm remembering correctly, this is one of the events that's in all four Gospels. So that truly shows that his disciple, the Gospel writers, took seriously Jesus's proclamation that they are to tell others about this event. Right, so Mark's account of the anointing of Bethany. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the jar and poured it over his head. But there were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment thus wasted? For this ointment might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they reproached her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you will, you can do good to them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burying. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." And now let us see Luke. Da, da, da. So what happened? Yes, I've been misremembering. Oh, it is not in Luke. Okay, I misremembered. I thought it was in all four Gospels. Well, 3 out of 4 ain't bad. Oh, no, right. Luke has a parallel account that might have been a different event that was earlier in the public ministry. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so similar event, but different location. All right. So, John, in his accounting of the events that Matthew and Mark mentioned, identifies Judas Iscariot as the lead indignant complainer over what had just occurred. And he notes that his complaint about the cost of the ointment, which, see if I, which if my earlier guess of one denarii being the equivalent of $50 is correct for the sake of argument. I could be wrong, but assuming that is correct, then essentially this would have been around a $15,000 jar of ointment, assuming my math is correct. So this also hints that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were a family of means if they were able to afford this. And so Judas, he gives the stock objection, the objection to the wealth of the Catholic Church that we have to this day. If we have all these resources, why aren't we giving it to the poor? And it's interesting that this objection occurs after an act of charity has been shown to Jesus. And John clarifies that Judas didn't really, or he wasn't necessarily actually concerned about the poor in this case. Rather, this is kind of a, let's see what's the proper term for it. Essentially, him giving an objection to cover up his own sins, trying to make excuses for his own thievery from the money to which he was entrusted. You know, oh, I'm going to steal from the collection box at church. This is hypothetical. I would never actually do this. But then when I see a genuinely good act, I try to shift the focus and say, oh, why are we giving to the poor? It's that type of mindset Judas is trapped in. And of course, even though John later reflects on the fact that he was stealing, that which hints that the other disciples might not have known about it at the time, although it's possible they did. But I think not, considering even during the Last Supper, the rest of the disciples still had some trust in Judas and with the handling of the money. Jesus, of course, can see into Judas's heart. He knows what's really going on. So in John's account, he summarizes the more lengthy speech that we have in Matthew and Mark about the significance of this event. And he chooses to end it with, "The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." I do not mean for that sneeze to occur in the video. In other words, if you want to care for the poor, then care for the poor, but do so in a virtuous manner. But also don't forget that I am not always going to physically be here with you. I have been anointed for my burial. My time is coming. Therefore, you should also be keeping your focus on me and not on the concerns of the world around you. The poor will always exist. There is always going to be ample opportunity to give charity to the poor. But Jesus hints to Judas, we will not always have ample opportunity to give charity to him. And I'd like to end it with a reflection from the soon-to-be sainted Blessed Fulton Sheen, where he was reflecting on a priest retreat he was giving, and he came across a priest who was complaining about the wealth of the Catholic Church. How come the church isn't doing more to help with the poor? And this isn't necessarily, and even we have to realize before John clarified for Judas that he wasn't doing it out of virtuous intention. The mere comment on the wealth of the church isn't necessarily a bad thing to comment on. After all, St. Teresa of Avila did so, as did St. Francis of Assisi. But Fulton Sheen, much like John in his later reflection with Judas Iscariot, could tell that there was something more to the priests complaining about the wealth of the church. So he pulls aside the priest in private, and he, with spiritual probing, asked the priest, "How long have you been stealing from the collection box?" And of course, the priest gets indignant and tries to change the subject because, of course, that wouldn't be something you'd want to admit, let alone admit to your bishop. But Fulton Sheen doesn't give up. He remains insistent on his question, "How long have you been stealing from the collection box?" And Fulton Sheen reported that the priest eventually dropped his pride, fell to his knees, and confessed to Fulton Sheen on the spot, likely begging for forgiveness. So the objection that Judas Iscariot gives to Jesus being anointed isn't a new objection, it isn't an old objection, and it is an objection we still see with us today. Let us be mindful that we do not fall into the same trap that Judas falls into, where he places worldly concerns over obedience to God. With that, this has been the Giant Papist, where, unlike Judas Iscariot with Saint Mary of Bethany, We judge not by appearances, but by the sanity of one's doctrine. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you till the next time.